Good evening, everyone. We stand here in a very historic site, and to get a full idea of how historic it is, we need to go firstly back a little bit in history, and then I'll go back further. So if we were to stand here around 200 years or a little bit more ago, we would be in a very remote area. At the beginning of the 19th century, between the village of Killiney and the Shangana River, and up the hill to the top of Killiney Hill at the obelisk, within that entire area, we'd only find about 6 or 8 houses at that time, and the ruins of this church. We would find Martello Tower and 2 gun batteries down at the shore, and we'd have Killiney Hill Road going through the middle. We'd also have Military Road, as that had recently been constructed to lead to the Martello Tower and the... going back 200 years ago, we had very few houses, just the 2 roads there and the coastal defences. And during the 19th century, there was a huge amount of development. Early in the century, the great polymath scholar George Petrie had inspected this church here and decided it was exactly where he wanted to be buried. He loved the remoteness of it, the peacefulness, and unfortunately 2 of his children died and are buried here in the churchyard. But by the time he died in the 1860s, Killiney had changed radically, and he was buried in Mount Jerome. But just that comment that he made about choosing here because of its peace and restfulness. So how did this all come about? Well, going back to about 1,500 years ago, a church was founded on this site by, we know from records, the daughters of Lenin. And there were 7 daughters have been recorded in the annals, and we know their names. What we don't know is whether they were actual biological daughters, or whether the daughters refers to nuns, because this may well have been a nuns' church, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But we mustn't think of the church as we see it today, going back to that period, because stone churches didn't appear in Ireland until the 10th century. So we're talking about the 5th century here. So any building that would have been here on a site would have been of wood, including the church itself and any houses that they would have had to live in, and for any other buildings for other purposes. So we know very little, because there's just a few records in the annals and various other writings that tell us information, and so beyond the fact that it was here and it was the daughters of Lenin who'd founded it, we know very little for the first 500 years or so. And then the church itself is built in the 11th century. And not the bit where I'm speaking here, but the bit where some of you are, the larger area over to one side here, is the original stone church built in the 11th century. And it's the transition between 2 different architectural periods. It has a flat-headed doorway for the entrance at the west end, and it has a semicircular arch between the nave and the chancel. And this is where the clue comes in that it may have been a nun's church, because under that flat head to the doorway, and the west doorway, incised into the underside of that stone, there is a cross. And the other church where it is known there's a cross there is St Mary's Church in Glendalough, which was known to have been a nun's church. So by analogy, and the fact that we have the daughters of Lenin who may have been nuns rather than actual daughters, it's thought this may have been a nun's church in its early years. But after the Norman invasion, when the Normans introduced the parish system, this became a parish church. A parish church with very few houses around it, so people would have been coming from a distance to attend church here. And we know that they did, because if it was just a very small congregation, they would not have needed to build on this bit at the side here from where I speak, because this is built in the later medieval period. So we have those two phases of the church. And then in the main part of the church, over on the southern side, there's a large window there which dates from the 15th century. So it tells us that it was still very active and still had a congregation to make it worthwhile getting more light into the church at that stage. So then also in the 16th century we get the Reformation. And I don't need to go into any detail with what happened in the Reformation, but suffice to say that with Henry VIII's break from Rome, we got in Ireland a dichotomy where the majority of the population were Roman Catholic, and the churches belonged to the Church of Ireland, the church buildings. And so this is what was the case with Killiney and so many other churches around. Now, what would happen after that is you have very, very small congregations, very small income for the church, and generally they didn't have the money to keep them up. So gradually over the next 100 years, the dry rot would get in, roofs where they couldn't afford to keep the roofs going, and many of the churches went out of use. We're very lucky that two of the Anglican archbishops did surveys of their churches in 1615 and 1630. And the first of those records that Killiney Church was in use at that time. The second one in 1630 records that the church was in ruins. So we know to a very close date when the church went out of use. So the church itself went out of use as a parish church, but the burial ground continued as the burial ground for everyone in the Killiney area into the 20th century. From the mid-19th century, there was the alternative of going to Dean's Grange, or if you chose to go further afield, to Glasnevin or Mount Jerome. But here, burials continued in the churchyard right up to the mid-20th century. But the church has never been forgotten. The very fact that it's in the condition it's in today shows that over the years it has been preserved from falling down. When you get loose stones, they've been repaired. And of course, what we're here to commemorate today is the latest in that phase, when the perimeter wall was in danger and has been repaired. That wall, incidentally, is 19th century. So the rest of the church being 1,000 years old or so, we're very lucky that we still have it today. Thank you. Thanks.